Well, hello and welcome to today's meeting of Democrats of Greater Tucson. My name is Larry Bodine, and I'm the president of Democrats of Greater Tucson, and I'll be your host today. And we're all thrilled to have our speaker, Jeremey Lasher. Jeremey, give a wave to everybody. Fantastic to have you back in Arizona after you turned Georgia blue. I wanted to start with a quick quote, which is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." These were the words that were said by Martin Luther King, whom we celebrate today. And even though he was murdered 52 years ago, his spirit and message still live on. And this is a momentous week for Democrats. We're going to have Joe Biden as president on Wednesday. And for the first time in 10 years, Democrats will control the Congress, the Senate, and the presidency. And demonstrating what we have to look forward to, President Biden has announced he's going to make several executive orders, including rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, extending the eviction moratorium, issuing a COVID-19 mask mandate for all federal offices, and revoking Trump's travel ban on Muslim nations. And all of this, to me, calls to mind the words of Martin Luther King when he said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And as of today, we Democrats are much closer. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to Kathy Ramich White. Kathy, why don't you come back? And Kathy is our board member who is in charge of membership, and she always has a great message.
Well, hello, everyone. I have only good things to say about Tucson and the weather. Right now, I am enjoying our meeting via Zoom while I am at the Desert Museum with my grandchildren from Colorado. So that's fun. Now, are you all hearing me?
Oh yeah, hear you fine.
Okay, that's good. That's good. All righty. Well, my purpose here is to jiggle and wiggle and get you all awake so that you realize it's time now to renew your dues. If you're new to DGT, you may not know they're only $20. You can renew right online through Act Blue, and so it's very, very easy. It's a wonderful organization. I don't know of any other place where we can chat with friends who think politically like us, and all of you people are delightful. So if you haven't yet renewed, or if you're not yet a member, please join. Even though Jeremey is very rarely with us, he's a member. And so everybody else, please come on and join. Thanks a lot, everybody. You be well.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, all of the good things that Democrats have to look forward to were made possible by the work of people like Jeremey Lasher, who worked successfully to get 2 Democratic U.S. senators elected in Georgia. Jeremey has a terrific bio. He's the former national canvass director at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in 2018. He's the former parliamentarian at the Disabilities Issue Caucus of Young Democrats of America from 2013 to 2015. He was a field organizer for the Arizona Democratic Party in support of Ron Barber's run for Congress in 2012. And he was a worker for LD10's Democratic Senator Kirsten Engel. And of course, notably, Jeremey's grandmother, Sandy Binion, is Democrats of Greater Tucson's first vice president and program chair. And with that, Jeremey, we're all dying to hear, how did you turn Georgia blue? And how can we apply those lessons here?
Well, Larry, board, thank you guys for having me back. I'm happy I get a chance to speak with everybody. I have to go over a couple of things at the start, just in case anybody's recording this, because when you work with some of the folks I work with, there's non-disclosure agreements and everything. So I did not work with the Democratic Party during 2020 or 2021. I actually worked with an organization called Fieldworks. They're a national progressive campaign organization. They work with a lot of different organizations to try and make sure that we're able to talk to voters in the field. You know, a lot of petition drives, voter registrations, get out the vote. And then Fieldworks in turn works for a number of different organizations. So some of the pictures you'll see in this presentation aren't specifically pictures from the organizations I was working with because, you know, they have their own messaging they want to get out there, and I didn't want to misrepresent any of the organizations I worked with. And so just bear that in mind, that this presentation is a representation of some of the work that I was lucky enough to work on, but isn't necessarily the exact organizations I was working with to protect them and their requests. So just to give you guys a little bit of background, what I did in 2020 and 2021. So primarily in Arizona, I worked on three main kind of buckets, we'll call them. One, we did a massive petition drive earlier in the year that unfortunately was not successful. We collected enough signatures for it, but a Republican appointed judge decided that the language was just too damn confusing for voters. So they threw it off the ballot. I'm not going to talk much about the petition drive because I want to use this time today to talk about some of the efforts we did in Arizona, some of the efforts I was lucky enough to take part of in Georgia, and some of the lessons learned in Arizona and Georgia and how we might be able to apply there. So in Arizona and Georgia both, I was able to work on statewide scale voter registration projects. And then on statewide scale, get out the vote efforts. So actually going out and talking to voters and making sure they showed up. In Arizona, it was for the general election, and Georgia, it was for the Senate runoff and the Senate special election runoff that happened in January. Okay, so to give you an idea of what we were trying to accomplish here in Arizona during 2020 and 2021, and to talk a little bit about some of the failings we had in Arizona on reaching some of our goals. So Arizona has always been at the forefront of pushing for registrations. We're actually one of the best states in the country on early voting. We adapted the permanent early voter list very early in comparison to what a lot of states were facing because of the COVID restrictions. So we've always made a big effort and push with that. We've always talked about bringing on new voters and making sure that everybody is registered. A couple of different organizations that were out there this year started stating that they were going to register 1 million people this year. And if they had said that in January of 2020, before we knew about COVID, that could have been, you know, something that was absolutely possible. Unfortunately, it was said in August of 2020, before many organizations were actually able to go out and start in-person voter registrations. So to give you a little bit of a history of Arizona and registration increases that we've had, you know, starting back in 2008, we increased from just under 3 million to in 2010, just over 3 million, about 200,000 registration increase, which was really nice. 2012, we stayed pretty stacked. We actually lost a few between 2010 and 2012, gained about 100,000 by 2014. And some of the major efforts from some nonpartisan groups here in Arizona, working in conjunction with the state party, really started kicking in 2014 and 2016. So we saw a pretty big increase, about 250,000 between 2014 and 2016. In 2018, we gained about another 120,000, really working hard. But to give you historical context, claiming that we're going to register 1 million new people in what accounted to about 2.5 months on the registration deadline was a really high goal to set. Especially during COVID-19 and the restrictions that were placed on us because of our ability to talk to people in person. How did we do? Well, so the organizations I was working with were in 4 main counties. We're in Coconino County, which is Flagstaff area. We're in Maricopa County, which is not just Phoenix, despite the fact that most people think it is, but has Glendale, has Mesa, has Scottsdale, has this huge area of over 4 million people that we are trying to register to vote. We are in Pima County and then in Yuma County. We also went out into a couple other smaller areas. We went to Cochise County. We went into, into Nogales. We were in Pinal County and Casa Grande for our voter registration efforts. But the main numbers and kind of what tells the story of what happened, I think, in Arizona in 2020 when it comes to voter registration, and later on what happened when we tried to turn out voters, can be told with these 4 counties. If you look at Coconino, this chart shows you kind of where we were at the primary election date, and then where we're at in the general election date. And I use those 2 dates because roughly within about a week, that's when in-person voter registration efforts really started in Arizona. And then everybody who was registered for the general election is on here, even though those efforts stop about a month before the election actually starts. A little different in Arizona this year. But to give you an idea, in Coconino County, which is mostly Flagstaff and some of the surrounding areas, we gained 3,290, so almost 3,300 Democratic voters. At the same time, independents gained 2,700 and change, and Republicans gained 2,470, so almost 2,500. Not as big a gap as we would have liked to see in that county. And I'm going to explain why some of these numbers look as wonky as they do here in a second with some of the efforts that we were making and some of the issues that we faced because of COVID-19. The big story is Maricopa County, which has been leaning closer to Democratic results in the last couple of elections, and we saw some good returns there at the national level. But the reality is that Maricopa County, as large as it is still seeing more Republicans registered than Democrats, and they're actually outpacing us, at least in 2020. Okay, so Republicans gained almost 66,000 new registrants. Democrats were able to pull off just about 50,000 and independents about 45,000. Now, these numbers are specifically new registrants. These are people who had not been registered in the state before. So that means that it's going to be people who just turned 18. It's going to be people who just moved here. It's going to be people who have been here for a while but registered for the first time. Okay. In Pima County, we had a massive lead for the Democratic Party. We saw 27,353 new registrants for Democrats, only 14,600 for Republicans, and about 11,000 and change for independents. Pima County has long been kind of the driving force of Democrats in our state. The problem is we're just outnumbered. When we look at Maricopa County versus us, they're looking at over 4 million people. We're saying right around 1 million people. So if we could flip those population numbers, and we would be a Democratic stronghold for the rest of forever. But right now we're still facing that. We try and make up for the lack of the numbers in Maricopa County on registrations by combining a lot of the counties out there. And the last one's going to be Yuma County. So Yuma County, Democrats only registered 1,911 new registrants. Republicans were able to register 3,075 new registrants. And some of the issues we faced in Yuma County that are somewhat unique, Larry was actually talking about before we started the meeting. We're seeing that the Republican Attorney General here in Arizona is going after 2 women who work and live in Yuma County in the San Luis area for ballot harvesting is what they're claiming. And one of the reasons for that is the San Luis area doesn't have mail service and doesn't have addresses that are able to be recorded a lot of times with the Secretary of State and with the Yuma County recorders. So we spent a large amount of our time in Yuma down in the San Luis area trying to register voters. And the majority of people that we registered in the San Luis area registered as Democrats or independents. But their registrations were not considered valid because the addresses they had weren't matched up to the US Postal Service in most situations. And so we saw, compared to the number of registrations we turned in versus the number of registrations that we saw as valid registrations, was far lower in Yuma County than anywhere else in the state. I'm not going to be digging in too much with that, but I think it would be great for DGT to maybe talk to our Secretary of State and see if we can't get some answers going forward on some of these areas like San Luis, some of the areas in the Navajo Nation where folks are trying to register to vote, and legally they're supposed to be allowed to, but if their addresses don't match up in the same way that the US Postal Service says that they should, their registrations aren't counting. So we were talking about getting 1 million people to register to vote. The last chart was just about like the efforts we made that I was personally involved with, which is mainly between the time of the primary election and the general election. I wanted to give us a better idea. Maybe we were able to register 1 million people between 2018 and 2020, which would have been a massive increase. It would have been about 3.5 times larger than we'd ever seen an increase before. Now, we did have a large increase in registered voters this cycle. We actually, if you look at here, total between 2018's off-year election and the 2020 election, over 340,000 new registrants came in that time. Pretty big numbers. Unfortunately, statewide, again, we lost Democrats versus Republicans. Republicans gained 137,000 change, almost 138,000. Democrats gained 101,000, about 7.9% increase compared to Republicans' 10% increase on their original numbers. And then independents or others, 106. So independents actually out-registered Democrats. 340,000 is an insane number of voters to register in 2 years compared to Arizona's historical numbers. So the efforts that we've been making on registration have been very good. The issues we're facing right now is that registration in the state of Arizona is becoming difficult. And I don't want to make judgments based on 2020 alone on if the efforts we made in 2020 during COVID restrictions were enough and how they should affect what we're doing going forward. But there are definitely some key takeaways that we have here. And that's that right now, despite our best efforts, Republicans are still out registering Democrats. And despite the fact that we were able to win some of the statewide races in 2018 and some of our federal races in 2020, we didn't see those numbers come down to our down ballot races. GOTV is going to play a big part of that, but voter registration also plays a big part of it. And one of the things that we need to do in Arizona is to redouble our efforts of partisan Democratic voter registration. A lot of the voter registration that happens in Arizona is done at a nonpartisan level. In every year except for 2018, or sorry, except for 2020, a lot of that's actually done at the MVD, at the Motor Vehicle Division. If you go in to change your address, if you go in to get a license, you check a box, you can register to vote. The people who work at the MVD don't always follow up with people on which party they'd like to register for. So a lot of people end up not checking the box on a party, and that's why we get a lot of independent registrations. But the in-person voter registration efforts that happen are usually done by nonpartisan groups. And the organization I was working with this cycle was a nonpartisan group. We had efforts to try and register people of color, new registrants who had not been registered in communities that had not been reached out to before. And we made a strong inroads into that. And there are other organizations who historically have been in Arizona who have been making those same efforts and have done a very good job considering the lack of resources we've seen put into Arizona for its size compared to some of the other states that we've seen out there on voter registration programs. But when you are required by law to do nonpartisan voter registration and you can't talk about the parties, you can't talk about the candidates, and you can't talk to people about reasons that they should be registering one way or another, we see these numbers where we're being out registered by Republicans by 36,000 in these off years. Some of the the issues we faced in registration in 2020 compared to other years is some of the places we couldn't get into that we normally would. Some of the key areas that we would register Democrats and younger voters in years past. So universities and community colleges were closed across the board. We got a week and a half, it was 9 days of the University of Arizona being open for students during our voter registration. And then a number of students started testing positive and the university went to essentially a shutdown. They weren't allowing people who weren't registered for classes to come onto the campus. They had shut down many of the actual classes and they implemented structures that probably should have been implemented in the first place and might have helped save some of those people who were infected with COVID. But in every year past, universities and community colleges have been the landmark of where you go to register young voters. New voters who might have just turned 18 or people moving into a state or moving to a new dorm or near there, they need to update their registrations. Without those, it made it very difficult to register young voters We couldn't get access to the dorms in ways that we might have been able to beforehand. We couldn't get access to any of the Greek facilities that we have been able to do in years past on programs I've worked with. So we were kind of stuck being at public locations near the colleges and hoping that students were just coming by there to get food if they were in lockdown. Made it a little more difficult. Motor vehicle divisions, while people are automatically registered to vote at the MVDs here in Arizona, if they check a box, they've always still been great locations for us to go and help people to register correctly, make sure they fill out the form correctly. Because again, at the motor vehicle division, their job isn't to register to vote. It's just one of the check boxes they have that allow it. Paid canvassers and volunteers have always been able to go to the MVDs and help people register to vote. Because of the COVID restrictions, they were limiting the number of people who were allowed to be there and limiting the number of people who were allowed to be there who weren't actively having business in the MVDs. So it wasn't really a viable location. Almost every library in Pima County shut down the ability to go in there and browse and have open access because of COVID-19, which meant areas where we could normally register people who went to the libraries weren't available. The folks who were coming to pick up books, who were able to have internet access and could book a time that they would come by and have somebody run out their books, usually didn't need to be registered to vote. But the people who hang out at libraries throughout the day, because there's a public restroom there and because it's a place where you can go and get access to the internet, it's a place where you can go to get education and to help yourself looking for new jobs, didn't have access to those libraries the way they used to. So we weren't able to register them and help them. Farmers markets and swap meets had always been locations that we could book time or be right outside of and register voters. But in Pima County, in Maricopa County, and Yuma County, and in Coconino County, all of them had done strict rules that they weren't going to allow any organizations that were doing any type of politics during COVID-19 because they had to turn away some of their usual vendors just for space and to make sure people were keeping 6 foot minimum distances. So they weren't allowing anybody new on. So we didn't have those venues. And then many retail locations that we used to use in the past, every single grocery store in Arizona had issued out memos stating that they weren't going to allow anybody to be on their property who weren't there specifically to be shoppers at their stores. CVS and Walgreens that we've had really great efforts with before, and places that people still needed to go to during COVID-19, also issued out orders that nobody was allowed to be there who wasn't actually a customer there. They didn't want people out front because under their understanding of COVID, they had to make sure that they were keeping socially distanced. They were only allowed to have so many people into their facilities, and they didn't want to provide a place where somebody might have gotten sick. Now, the organization I was working with had actually shut down for about a month and a half right after COVID really reared its head. And when Arizona decided that we were going to have we'll call it soft shutdown, because our governor absolutely did the best thing he could for every Arizonan and made sure that people were safe. That's sarcasm for those who can't tell my voice yet. But when they shut down, it actually gave us some time to look at how would we as an organization safely talk to voters, whether it was going to be out in public for petitions, for voter registration, or at doors. And we completely revitalized the way we went about talking to voters. We changed every effort we made to ensure that safety was first. And that's one of the reasons it led to, again, lower numbers. We didn't do what organizations have done in the past, which was give somebody a clipboard and have them run up to you and ask you if you're registered to vote and walk you through the form. We set up tables that allowed folks to keep 6 foot social distancing. We had large print offs so people could see step by step, and we trained our staff repeatedly on walking people step by step on the forms to make sure they filled it out correctly without us being right on top of them. We had hand sanitizer and masks and single-use disposable pens. I'm sorry to Nick and Lee and to my environmental friends. We had to use a lot of plastic this year, and I've written the checks I can to try and counterbalance that. But we had to make sure that we were safe when talking to voters, because in a lot of communities, we were the only opportunity that voters had to register to vote now. If they didn't have access to online, if they didn't have somebody who was telling them how to register online and making sure their information was correct, most of the public venues that people have relied on for the last decade to register to vote were closed to them. And so they had to rely on folks from my organization and from a few other organizations here in Arizona that were able to do in-person voter registration. The good news is that because of the efforts we made for that 6 weeks when we weren't able to go out and talk to people, we developed these tactics that allowed us to safely talk to voters and make sure they had the information that they needed to both register to vote and to get out to vote. Our organization, alongside a couple of organizations, kind of pioneered the ideas of being able to have safe, effective door knocks with voters and safe, effective voter registration tables and petition drives around the country. And different organizations from around this country actually started taking our programs and implementing them. So we had a number of different organizations who stopped in and just wanted to observe how we did launches, how we did making sure our folks were safe, going through the COVID countdowns, and making sure that we weren't sending people out into the community who might be ill, and making sure that our folks didn't go out there and get ill from somebody in the community. Because as much as I would have loved to have seen this happen in Arizona, there was no state mandate for masks. And so the folks who were going out there registering voters all too often had to deal with individuals who weren't wearing masks or actively didn't believe in masks, and would communicate that in ever so friendly ways to folks who are going out there trying to register voters. Okay. That sounds really negative on registering voters, right? We didn't register 1 million people. To give you guys an idea of how many we did register, though, between 2018 and 2020, we went from 3,716,000 and change registered voters to 4,281,000 registered voters. We gained 564,889 new registered voters in 2 years, which is almost double what we've done in years past. Okay, so you can see the jumps here from 2008 up till now, 2020, when we're at 4.2 million. We've registered 1.3 million people in 12 years. Brand new registrants. Just between the primary election and the general election in Arizona, we registered 295,942 new registrants. That's despite COVID restrictions. That's despite the fact that many people, thankfully, were staying home and not going out to public locations where we could actually talk to them. We still registered 295,000 registrants, which is insane when you consider the amount of just hurdles that were put in the way for people trying to register voters. One of the other fun things that happened in Arizona with voter registration, that's something we've never faced before and hopefully we'll never have to face again, is our last day to register voters for the general election changed on us. And it changed on us with no notice and at the last minute. So originally, October 5th, my birthday, was the last day we could register voters. And we did a massive operation across the state to ensure that every single registration that one of our folks collected got to the proper county authorities by closing time on October 5th, making sure that everybody's registration would count. Early voting was supposed to start October 7th, 2 days later. And that's what happens in Arizona. We stop about 2 days early, then early ballots are going out. And most organizations, whether it's the parties or nonprofit organizations and nonpartisan organizations that are going to go out and talk to voters, take those couple of days to flip their offices, to retrain their staff, to make sure everybody's going forward. That's what we did. We ended on the 5th. We took the 6th and the 7th to train our directors, to train our canvassers, and to bring on some new directors so we could expand our operations on how to go out and talk to voters about Mr. Biden and Mr. Kelly, right? We switched organizations that we were working with. We are still working with a nonprofit group that was part of the Arizona table that allowed us to talk specifically about candidates. So voter registration is 100% nonpartisan with the efforts we were doing. Now we're able to go out there and talk to voters. We're psyched to do it. The last day to request your mail-in ballot was October 23rd, and the last day to vote early in person was going to be October 30th. And then a lawsuit happened from one of the organizations here in Arizona that said, hey, because of COVID, we have not had enough time to register voters. And they agreed. They said, okay, new registration deadline is October 23rd. That decision was made on October 6th, 1 day before early ballots go out, 1 day after we've started training and transitioning over, after the parties and all the nonpartisan, nonprofit groups in the state had said, okay, we're done with voter registration. We're going to start talking to voters. Well, now we're just given 2 more weeks to register voters. And a newly registered voter is more likely to vote than somebody who's on the rolls who hasn't voted in the last couple of elections. So it's worth your time to try and register new voters, even above and beyond talking to voters who are on the rolls, who might not be 4x4 voters, might not vote all the time. So on the 7th, we decided really quick, okay, we've got 2 weeks. We're going to work with registered voters. We talked with the organization that was doing Get Out the Vote with us, and they said, yes, we want you to keep registering voters with this other organization. We understand you've got 2 weeks. We're going to redo everything. Go out there and register voters. So on the 8th, we retrained all the new folks who just came on that we had just trained on how to do doors on how to do voter registration, because there's a long legal process on registering voters and making sure everybody does it correctly. On the 9th, we were back out there registering voters. On the 10th, we were out there registering voters. On the 11th, we were out there registering voters. On the 14th, we were out there registering voters when a new lawsuit came in and a judge overturned it and said, hey, guess what? The deadline to register to vote in Arizona is now the 15th of October, the next day. So we had to stop all voter registration efforts on the 14th so that we could get all those voter registrations turned into the proper counties by closing time on October 15th. We had to stop the efforts of having canvassers out in the field, being able to talk to voters, put them on voter registration, stop them again, and then retrain everybody to go out there and talk to voters. We had to do a total retrofit for a plan of 2 weeks of registering new voters that turned into 1 week with only 1 day's notice of registering voters, and then switch it again to start talking to voters about the upcoming election. Not an easy haul, but we got it done. We switched over and we started talking to voters. And that's when we started doing Get Out the Vote. Sorry, I just have fun with PowerPoint sometimes. Get Out the Vote is literally the act of talking to our voters and turning them out. I was lucky enough to be working with one of the few organizations across the entire country that was doing the one thing we know for a fact helps turn out voters. That's face-to-face conversations, talking to voters about candidates and helping them make a vote plan so that they can vote. Okay. I've heard a lot of questions over the last few months about why did we struggle in Arizona to win our legislative races that were so close? Why did we lose races in Maricopa County that were so close, that we had won in 2016, that we had won in 2018? Why were we struggling across the entire country to pick up legislative House races and legislative Senate races that we should have won? Why did New Hampshire flip to Republicans after we had just flipped it to Democrats? Why was it so close, this election, between President-elect Biden, somebody who genuinely cares about humanity, and a stain on the history of the United States who will hopefully go away soon, and his influence, you know, you can, if you're a decent human being, you will vote one way. And the fact of the matter is that Biden and Kelly had people knocking on doors for them, talking to the voters about the candidates, talking to undecided voters about why to vote, and helping people in disadvantaged areas to actually make plans to get to the polls. Unfortunately, for many down ballot candidates, they didn't have those efforts on their behalf. They did what was called a lit drop. And some places, just that act of having volunteers out there and being able to see meant that lit drops could be minorly effective. And some locations, there are more folks outside of their house talking to you. If you're in suburban areas, if you're in areas where places where people have a yard or a garden they're upkeeping, or they're washing their car out front, you might catch people outside and have a higher contact rate where you're talking with folks. And I do not want to disparage any of the efforts of any volunteers or organizers that went out and did lit drops, because they were advised to do lit drops, right? They were told it wasn't safe to go out there and knock on doors. It wasn't safe to try and talk to voters. And they were advised by the Biden campaign in some situations. They were advised by county and state parties not to put themselves at risk, because If you were within 12 feet, there was a possibility. And if you were knocking on doors, it would upset people. We spent a lot of time as an organization and talking with our partners on whether or not it was worth it to knock on doors. We had to make sure that canvassers could be trained effectively and quickly in some pretty basic healthcare rules on what they were allowed to do out in the field. We had to make sure that we got the supplies and the supply chains that we needed to get them the tools they needed. No canvasser in my organization touched a doorbell with their fingers, because doorbells are high touch areas and it's very hard to clean your fingers if you're knocking on 120 doors a day. So we had to source and get them doorbell ringers, little copper keys that they could press a doorbell with, and then use an alcohol wipe to clean that device off so that they weren't spreading germs from place to place. We had to map out what 6 feet was for everybody and what 12 feet looks like, so you know where people were at. We had to fire canvassers who were hugely effective and wanted to go out and talk to people because they wouldn't wear a mask correctly in public. All right. We had to make sure that a large portion of our efforts were based on safety rather than the ability of just going out and talking to voters. And a lot of organizations didn't have that ability. I was lucky enough to be working with an organization who has been doing this long enough. They're large enough, and they had the clients who had deep enough pockets to say safety was number one. Number two was going out there and talking to the voters. With that, we were able to more efficiently affect voter turnout than the organizations who didn't have those resources and weren't able to make face-to-face conversations with the voters. And the people who suffered for that, by and large, were down ballot candidates. Because if you turned on the TV right before the election, you weren't missing that Joe Biden and Donald Trump were running for president. You weren't missing that Martha McSally and Captain Mark Kelly were running for the Senate, right? They had the money to buy those spots. If you turn on the radio, it was there. If you open the newspaper, there was full page ads telling you about them. But legislative candidates and county candidates didn't have those resources. In a few situations, we were able to overcome those, right? Gabby being elected to the county recorder had the whole power of the Pima County Democratic Party behind her, had outside money and organizations contributing to her because it was going to be a historic election. We were able to overcome that. But in other situations, like losing the recorder's office in Maricopa County, because they didn't have the ability to talk to voters one-on-one and help them to make their plan to go to vote. If you go up to a door and there's 40 pieces of literature there that everybody's dropped off, and it's your door and you look at them, that much literature is going in the trash. If you open your mailbox and there's 40 pieces of literature, you're not reading through them anymore. People got an absolute glut of non-personalized information sent to them about elections, most of it repeating the same stuff. This is election day, vote for this one person. This is election day, vote for these two people, they're great for this position. It's very hard to help voters make a plan of, okay, your polling place has changed and now you need to go to this polling place. Okay, election day is this day, but have you gotten your mail-in ballot yet? Okay, election day is this day. Do you know where you're going? Do you know, oh, you're not going to be here for election day. Here's where the emergency vote locations are. If we send out mailers, if we drop off pieces of literature and somebody doesn't walk you through that form, it is not as effective as somebody at your door who's gotten hours worth of training saying, hey, let me walk you through this form, let me talk to you, and let me have you say out loud your plan to vote. So that's some of the stuff that we saw in Arizona, why we were able to have a record turnout with total numbers, why we were able to have an overtake of a Senate seat that we're fighting for, why we were able to turn Arizona blue for the first time since I moved here back in, well, I originally came here in 2000. Somebody help me out. Have we won for the president in Arizona since 2000? I think Clinton took it once, right?
I believe it was 1953. Since
Okay.
the last time, at least, we had two Democratic U.S. senators. So it's been a long time.
So I'm unfortunately not in 1B for COVID. I am not a 75 or older voter, and I think it's going to be a little bit of time before they allow me to get some of these vaccinations. So yeah, 53 was a little bit before my time. The efforts made across this country to win the election for Joe Biden were monumental. We had more volunteers than we've ever seen before. The problem was that in order to keep people safe, we were using metrics that we knew had a lower probability of turning out voters. So many people made phone calls. So many people made texts. So many people sent postcards. But the problem was that voters were given a ton of the same information without anybody explaining it to them. The difference with talking to a voter at the door is you can take a couple of minutes to talk about an issue, to explain an issue, and to help somebody make a plan. And that's what allowed us, and I'm going to move over to Georgia in a little bit, but one of the major differences you'll see from the Georgia special election and the runoff election compared to the general election across the entire country was that there was a concerted effort by the Democratic Party and every organization in Georgia to focus on in-person conversations with voters. And they took the lessons that we learned from the 2020 general election and implemented those in Georgia to make sure that we were knocking on every door. They didn't do everything perfectly, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but they made sure that they knew if you talk to somebody face to face, it can bump them up to 9 points in the polls. If you send somebody a text, a phone call, if you send somebody a mailer, if we're lucky, it's 2% with all of those put together. And that's why some of these elections were so tight that we weren't expecting. So I want to do some anecdotes. There's some stuff I shouldn't put in writing just in case anybody is recording this. These won't kind of say who I was working with, but to give you an idea of some of the races here in Arizona that could have been affected by pig canvassing, and some of the troubles that you face when you're trying to organize and communicate and coordinate with so many different organizations that are in the state and divvy up where we're at. So we lost a couple of races that in any other year without COVID, with the type of groundswell efforts we saw on the Democratic side, we should have won and picked up. LD6, which is the Flagstaff area, we had a possible pickup for the House and a possible pickup for the Senate. We were trying to single shot somebody in the House. They ended up putting an independent candidate on there that hurt us as well. In the Senate, we had a well-known mayor who was well-respected in Flagstaff area alone. The problem with LD6 is that it's a little bit bigger than just Flagstaff. And when we were given the go-ahead to start knocking on doors, about a week and a half after ballots had already gone out, okay, we were only given precincts in Flagstaff proper. LD6 is much larger than that. So we were going out and talking to voters specifically and only in the Flagstaff proper area, which meant there were thousands and thousands of voters in LD6 who weren't getting an in-person conversation. 11 days later, we were given more precincts outside of the Flagstaff area because another organization who thought they were going to be able to do them wasn't able to do them. That meant that at that point, there was 9 days until the general election. There was 4 days of early voting left that we could try and influence voters in those outlying areas to vote down ballot for a state house and a state senate candidate that they had not heard of as often because both those candidates were well known in the Flagstaff area, but not in the surrounding areas. Don't think we could have changed the outcome in those races with the way that everything shook out. Even if we'd been able to go from day one and get out there, we might not be able to change the outcome for both of them. I'd like to believe that with our efforts and with some of the numbers we've seen in other areas that we could have changed maybe one of those races and picked up a state house seat or a state senate seat in that area because those margins were pretty close. But the fact that voters outside of the urban area of Flagstaff weren't talked to face about these candidates who are running meant they didn't get the opportunity to change their minds early enough and vote for them. The undervote in that area was extremely high. There was a large number of folks who voted for the president, who voted for the Senate, who voted for Tom O'Halloran for Congress, and did not vote at all for state Senate or state house because they hadn't heard from those candidates. They didn't know who they were. They weren't familiar with them. That's something we can work on in this next election cycle, is making sure that those legislative candidates have the ability to reach out beyond their urban cores for some of these seats. The other place where we lost a seat, holy shit, is LD4. LD4, we lost a Democratic stronghold seat. And looking at the numbers from voter registration and looking at the numbers that we have when we were knocking on doors, we know exactly why and where it happened. It happened in Yuma. It happened in the San Luis areas. We did not get the ability to talk about the House and Senate candidates in LD4 in Yuma. We were only talking about the top of the ballot. We were telling people about Biden. We were telling people about Kelly. And that can work in Pima County, and that can work in Maricopa County, where we drag people to the polls, and they tend to be stronger Democrats because they are working with the Democratic Party, they have an understanding of the Democratic Party, and they vote more realistically down ballot. But in Yuma County, where voters see the Democratic Party or see canvassers and organizations coming out to talk to them about voting once every 2 years for a 2-week period, they don't show up and vote for everybody else. They were told to vote for Biden. They were told to vote for Kelly. They went out and they voted for Biden. They voted for Kelly. They might have recognized a couple of the other names, but when you look at the county returns from Yuma County, the undervotes are all over the place, and down ballots were drastically affected. If we had had the opportunity to talk to people about those down ballots, or if we had had the opportunity to help those candidates who tend to have less money and not be able to reach out in the same manner that some of the candidates in some of the richer or more urban neighborhoods could have, we could have saved that seat. Again, I'm not trying to call out anybody for doing something wrong. We were facing an unprecedented pandemic that swept the entire country. We're in a state where our governor was actively saying that he wasn't going to help people, and everybody did the best they could with the information they had. But now looking back at it with the results, I think we know going forward, being able to talk to those voters one-on-one, face-to-face could have made a drastic difference, and could have been the difference between Arizona right now almost being a Democratic House and Senate and actually being a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. So there's some of the things we learned in Arizona. Thankfully, when Arizona ended, I got the opportunity, and I apologize. I think I'm probably going to run more than 10 minutes over. So if anybody has to leave, don't take that bad, and I just talk a little bit. But hopefully there'll be some questions at the end I'm happy to answer. Larry, is it okay if we go over a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. Go right ahead, Jeremy. Just remember, 10 minutes and our hour is up.
Yeah. So thankfully, when Arizona ended, and I was pretty happy with the work we did in Arizona, because we did pick up a U.S. Senate seat and we did flip Arizona blue for the president, which wasn't the case in a number of states that folks that I've been working with over the last few years were worked in. I got a call and I was said, hey, we have the opportunity to go to Georgia and do some voter registration. Arizona was one of the few states that ran an effective voter registration project despite COVID restrictions. We'd like you to come to Georgia and work with us. And I said, absolutely, let me on a plane. Because Georgia has a unique kind of historical situation going on there that I've never had the chance to work in. And I'm not egotistical enough to think I could make the change, but I wanted to be part of the change that I was seeing happening and hoping that I could just help out a little bit with it. So Georgia has a setup that if you don't win 50% or more in an election, there is a runoff election that starts with only the top 2 vote getters moving on to that. In one of the races, the U.S. Senate race in Georgia, it was pretty clear. There was 3 candidates. David Perdue, the Republican, barely edged out John Ossoff, the Democrat, but was not able to get to 50%. So there was going to be a runoff election. There was a Libertarian in there, which probably helped us out a little bit. But it was a pretty clear-cut case of you didn't get 50, we're jumping into a runoff election. On the special election, it was a little bit different. So we've had some experience with some special elections here in Arizona over the last couple of years. The Republican senator here had been replaced by Kelly Loeffler. The Republican governor had sent Kelly Loeffler in to make up that seat. Kelly had to run to fill up the end of that seat. And everybody and their mom decided to jump into that race. You can see there's half a dozen Democrats, half a dozen Republicans, some Green Party, some Independent. At the end of the day, Reverend Raphael Warnock was head and shoulders above everybody else with 1.6 million, but Kelly was able to hang on there with 1.2 million, despite a pretty strong challenge from Doug Collins, who was the Republican that a lot of the more conservative members of Georgia's Republican Party had wanted originally. Because of that, we got to go into a runoff election and a special runoff election that happened in January. To give you guys an idea of registration efforts in Georgia. So on the runoff election day, there was 7.2 million registered voters total across the state. On election day, that says 2018, I'm sorry, that shows at 2020. Sorry, no, that's 2018. There were 6.9 million registered voters. So in 2 years, about the same time that we register all our folks, they had registered 297,768 voters. In just the 1 month we were able to register voters in Georgia, we registered 75,852 brand new voters. These are people who had never registered to vote in Georgia before. These were college students, people who had just turned 18, people who had moved into Georgia, and a large number of folks that just had never thought voting mattered, and we were able to get them to register for the first time and show up because the entire country was looking at Georgia. And one of our biggest efforts there was to make sure people understood that their vote really did matter, because all of you who have done phone calls or knocked on doors and have always gotten that person who says, oh, I'm one person, why would it matter? The margins were so tight in Georgia, it absolutely mattered. We got 75,000. Now, to give you guys an idea, again, in Georgia, which has focused on registration efforts so much over the last couple of years, they were able to register 297,000 change voters. In Arizona, in that same time, we were able to register 564,889 voters. So just wanted to remind you all, like, Arizona's been kicking ass at this for a long time. When people ask, why aren't we doing better? We are. We started at a worse place with less voters, and we've overcome that. And I think we're honestly one election cycle away from having the type of story that Georgia just had, where we crush it across the entire board again. So, and again, to give you an idea, just between the primary and general election, we registered 295,000 people in Arizona. In the last 2 years in Georgia, they registered 297,000. So Arizona's done a much better job of registering voters continuously. We just need to make sure more of them are Democrats than Republicans going forward, and we're flipping that switch. Georgia faces something that Arizona does to a small degree, but not in the same ways or in the same numbers that they have. So Georgia has systemically disenfranchised voters of color for years and years. So much so that there was a law that said they had to submit any changes they wanted to make to voting plans. And then the Supreme Court in 2013 overturned that law. And we saw across Georgia hundreds of thousands of voters of colors disappearing from the rolls. And we saw dozens of polling locations close that were primarily in communities of color over and over again throughout Georgia. It didn't stop for the general election. It didn't stop for the special and the runoff election we just had. We were doing voter registration. We switched to get out the vote and early vote. We were talking to voters about making a plan to go and vote, either by mail, which in Georgia, you have to request a mail-in ballot. They do have what's called no excuse mail-in voting, but you still have to, every single election, request that ballot, wait for it to get to you, and then get back to the polls. We're doing this during Christmas. We were doing this when the U.S. Mail Service decided to not categorize ballots in the Georgia special election as first-class mail until the last week of the election. So we had almost 1 million, I believe, mail-in ballots turned in, which is insane for Georgia. But the efforts there that we had to do to try and make sure people were voting early were monumental. And it wasn't something that we did in the last 2 months. This is something that organizations have been doing since 2013. We've seen some large groups step up there. And then in 2018, Ms. Abrams took her loss as governor and said, okay, screw you guys. We're going to steal the entire state back by outworking you, out registering you, outvoting you, and making sure that we're gonna do it. But I want to put this up here because Stacey Abrams didn't start miraculously in 2018, and Stacey Abrams isn't the end all be all of what happened in Georgia. She's been working when she was minority leader to work across racial divides in Georgia and help organizations to make sure that the people who wanted to make change were in positions where they could when the time was there. When the voters were there and they could help out, Stacey made sure we were there. We saw so many organizations throughout Georgia that have been working nonstop to step up. And we all worked really well in conjunction with each other on what we were going to do. So one of the organizations, the Black Progressive Action Coalition, was working in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina in the 2020 general election. They moved all of their efforts to Georgia for the runoff election. And their job was 100% to knock doors for Black and African-American voters and help them make a vote plan. Where are you going to vote? When are you going to vote? Are you voting early? How are you getting there? Is your mom taking you? What is going on, right? That's their job. Georgia Stand Up has been doing in-person and digital organizing for years. They've been going out to smaller communities that tend to be larger voter of color population communities and helping people actually get to the polls and making sure, because what happens in a lot of these smaller communities is, oh yeah, sorry, we're going to close this polling location, that polling location, that one. They're almost always in urban neighborhoods with communities of color, and it's okay because we opened up these 2 new voter registrations in smaller suburban areas. But now if you're an urban voter and you rely on the bus, it's going to take you 3 hours to get to the polls, and then the polls are going to have a 3 and 4 hour line. So Georgia Stand Up has been fighting back against that and making sure that people can actually get to the polls. Fulton County Democrats, the Georgia Democratic Party, have been absolutely massive in turning out volunteer efforts. When we were there, because of the donations that are coming into the state, the Fulton County Democrats, which is the Atlanta area, and the Georgia Democrats were literally able to set up just like tents near like events that are going on for African American and communities of color, and offer people jobs on the spot to go out and talk to voters in their neighborhoods, something that we'd never seen. Literally being able to tell somebody, I can pay you for this next 2 weeks. You can take a break from your normal job, or you can not have to worry about paying for Christmas, and you don't have to worry about where your rent's coming in for the next week, just to go out there and talk to voters, which is insane because some of the areas we're in are so economically downtrodden that the 2 weeks of pay that came in there is a difference between somebody losing a house that they've been fighting for. The $600 that came in for the stimulus package was enough to make sure some of our canvassers could afford to eat or could keep their moms safe.
Jeremy, I'm going to have to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Regrettably, we are at the top of the hour. I want to respect people's time. And I know a number of people have been asking questions in the chat.
I'm sorry, I knew I went a little bit over, folks. There was so much to cover.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
What can be done to change the problem of registrations being valid in areas like San Luis or, I imagine our nation to overcome the difficulties created by the lack of mail service?
So the good news is there's already a law that's going to help us on some of this. There was a law that was passed that says native tribal lands in Arizona are going to get US recognized addresses. That's supposed to kick off, I believe, in 2021. So that by 2022, that should help us a lot. So San Luis, some of the Navajo Nation, some of the areas outside of Ajo, they've always struggled with having actually being recognized by either their county recorder or the Secretary of State. That's going to help. What we need to do going forward is to make sure that the state and the county parties have the resources and use those resources specifically on voter registration. Having volunteer efforts for voter registration is always helpful, but it doesn't see us have the results we need of the sheer numbers. If you're a volunteer and you're at a library for a couple of hours, right? Maybe you can register 5, 10 people if you're lucky. But if we're able to pay people who are out there trying to make a living and making sure that their houses are in order, making sure they get the food they need. If we're able to pay people from the community to go out to their community and talk to people at their apartment complex to make sure that they've updated their registration correctly, they've gotten a new registration, to make sure they can go out into small businesses that wouldn't welcome somebody from another community in there and help register them. That's what we need to do. We need to make sure that our county and our state parties know that they're supported by us giving them the resources they need, but also that we need them to spend those resources where they're going to do the most good. And the way that they're going to do the most good that I can see looking at the last 8 years that I've been operating in Arizona on and off is to do nonstop voter registration in underrepresented communities across this state and making sure that people see us more than once every 2 years. And alongside the voter registration is making sure that we're doing community outreach efforts. Something that Georgia did really well is making sure that you couldn't turn around and not see the efforts being made by other Georgians to make sure that people know what the Democratic Party is there for and why they should be showing up. And just a quick, let's see if he'll do this. So I went and bought donuts on one of my 2 days off when I was in Georgia, and just a random donut store had this little sign: vote January 5th, learn more at peachvote.com. Peach Vote was just another nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. They couldn't say vote for these candidates, but when you got there, it helped you make a plan. That was in so many small businesses. And then people went around every single light pole in downtown Atlanta, had this sign up, making sure people knew that in Georgia, the election didn't end on November 3rd, that they had to vote one more time. Making sure that people saw us throughout the community and knew how important this was huge. Our county parties and our state parties have to know that the way they're going to win is by making sure people in the community see us and the efforts that we're doing in those communities year round, nonstop, and not just when we show up to ask for their votes in October of 2022.
All right, we have a question from Katie Solon from Democrats Abroad. Katie, go ahead.
Hi, you guys. I live in Germany, but I'm in Scottsdale right now where I vote. So my question is focused more on Maricopa County, but we lost one of the best recorders in the US who so improved our voting legislation. How are we going to be able to stop from going back? But before I let you answer, I just want to say in 3 sentences, the overseas vote increased in Georgia and Arizona by more than 50%. In Arizona, we had at least 18,000 votes. In Georgia, we registered over 40,000 ballots were requested for the runoff compared to 25,000. So in both cases, Arizona and Georgia, the margin of overseas votes exceeded Biden's margin. You can say we helped win. So Jeremy, I want to know what you know about the overseas vote. And in a nutshell, Arizona overseas voters can vote with an email attachment. In Georgia, we had a postal mail or courier. If in both cases we had about 20,000 people vote, definitely there are 100,000 people abroad from Georgia and Arizona who could vote and who didn't vote. And so my plea is to make sure that we don't forget the overseas voters because they can help us win races in every state in the union.
Absolutely. Yeah. I haven't personally worked on a lot of the overseas efforts. When I was with the DCCC in 2018, we had a whole desk whose old job was just to talk with overseas voters and try and work with them. And the DNC has some plans there. So it might be worth talking to the state party to find out what efforts we can do here to try and bolster those. I just don't have any personal experience with that. But yeah, absolutely. Across the country, we saw out of overseas voters coming in, pouring in, and Georgia absolutely helped us. And here in Arizona, the number of organizations and groups that were able to claim this victory because their group was over the margin of victory. When you look at Native voters here in Arizona, blew past the margin of victory. When you look at Asian American Pacific Islander voters and the numbers they contributed in Georgia and in Arizona, past the margins of victories. When you look at these communities that we've not spent the time as coordinated county and state parties to reach out to in the ways that we could, they showed up this time and they blew the doors off. And I was lucky enough to work with a lot of organizations who said, we don't have the resources, we don't have kind of necessarily the experience, but we know our community. Work with us and help us to try and figure out how we can implement some of this. The organization I was working with made a concerted decision not to go into native lands during our voter registration drive. And the reason we did that was because COVID was running so badly in some of these native tribes that we didn't feel we could safely come in there, and we didn't want to risk the chance of exposing somebody outside of their community and bringing it into the community and getting people sick. So instead what we did was we worked with native organizers and helped them to have the tools, help find supply chains for them, help them go through trainings, and help to make sure that they had the information and the resources they needed to be able to reach out to their community that they've been trying to do for years and haven't always had the resources to do it. They blew the doors off the place. They made sure that we won here. And when you look at some of these reports back, like Navajo Nation, voting at like 98%, which is just astronomical. It's because we were able to finally give resources to the people who've been asking for them for years and let them just make sure their communities show up and vote. And that's what we need to be doing. For Maricopa County, how do we get back and make sure that we don't go backwards? Losing Adrian is absolutely heartbreaking. We need to make sure that, again, the resources are there. So one of the stories I can share real quick that might get me in trouble. So Bill Rowe, if you're still on, this is anecdotal and doesn't actually exist. Trying to balance who and which organizations going into which areas, a place like Maricopa County, which has, I think, 6 or 7 different LDs and has hundreds of precincts, and trying to get everything balanced is a monumental job. And trying to do it when people are requesting to go to different locations the day of or the night before and trying to move everybody around can be hugely different. We started doing door knocks in LD 17, which is Tempe and parts of Mesa, areas that we have a large Latino community that haven't shown up to vote in years past at the levels that we thought we could help organize. 4 days after we started our efforts, we were told not to knock in LD 17 anymore because the local legislative candidates were going to do lit drops there. And they were going to do a lit drop every single day until the election. So they moved us out of LD 17, which is, again, Tempe, which is a large number of younger voters where we could have had one-on-one in-person conversations with, and Latino communities throughout Mesa that we were pushed aside. We were given instead Apache Junction, which is about a 45-minute drive out and isn't necessarily a progressive bastion for voters. And we were given Casa Grande, which has good progressive voters, but just the populations in Casa Grande and in Maricopa, the community of Maricopa, were much, much smaller, and it added about an hour and 40-minute drive from where our offices were at. So it made it more difficult for us to reach as many voters as we wanted to. I think in 2022 and in 2024, as we're looking to pick up some of those seats in Maricopa and statewide that we lost and need there, we need to make sure that the organizations that are contacting voters in Maricopa County are the people who can do the most good. Candidates wanting to do lit drops, absolutely. There's no reason we shouldn't have been knocking doors right alongside them, because voters need multiple people talking to them. And when we look at where we lost some of these votes, we had an office in Glendale, but we were not allowed to knock on any of the doors in the Glendale, Avondale area because local candidates had them covered to do lit drops. We need to make sure that we find a way to get past the "this is my territory" thing and find a way to say, okay, that's your territory. Let's make sure you've got the resources you need to turn out the voters for you. Because if we're going to rely on pride of "I won this" rather than "okay, we won this and now I get to go on and change my community," we're going to lose. We have to make sure that we're all working together, sharing our resources and giving resources to the communities that need them to make sure that they can turn out. That means that, AZ2 in Ann Kirkpatrick was given so much money for years when AZ3, Grijalva's district, wasn't, because Grijalva's was a safe district. It was fine. We could win Grijalva's district for Congress. But the problem was there was no money then to go down ballot and try and get our legislative candidates to get, to have more support, to try and make sure that our statewide candidates could win in areas like Nogales, like Yuma, that are safe at one level and so are kind of forgotten. Not sure if that helps. I'm long-winded, sorry.
Jeremy, let me just read a comment that came in from Mallory Rieger as we close the program. She says, Jeremy, great presentation and so much important information. We're so grateful for your efforts and that Biden will be better situated to actually help our country. Thank you so much. How can people get a hold of you if they want to follow your exploits and support your efforts?
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook. If you just look for Jeremy M. Lasher, you can normally find me on there. You can also just email me at JAY Lasher82. I'll toss it in the channel real quick, my email, so you can always reach out. Here's the thing, like I've been fortunate enough, I can talk and type at the same time, I swear. I've been fortunate enough to learn from some amazing people around this country. I've been fortunate enough to literally fall into politics as an accident. In 2008, when I got started, I was in Denver for an entirely different job. The person I was working with bankrupted our company, stole my pots and pans, and left me with an apartment I couldn't afford by myself. And I answered an ad on Craigslist that happened to be Fieldworks, the organization I worked with this year. I spent 3 years with them traveling the country and learning how to do this. And then I was able to come back here. And when Gabby got shot, I was lucky enough to be chosen by a large number of dedicated organizers to kind of run the Cochise County area for Ron and for Richard Carmona to work with the state party. There are so many organizers in our community that are doing this work day in and day out and need your help. The job doesn't pay a lot. And again, I've been lucky enough to get to the point where I was able to work with the DCCC, and I'm able to run statewide programs now, so I can finally make a living. But for 10 years, being out there making that fight, you know, you're living off of just barely above the poverty level, being asked to travel around the country or around your communities and trying to get out there. So if you know an organizer, if somebody called you this year, if somebody texted you and had a conversation, if somebody invited you to come out and do a lit drop, talk to them and see what they need. I'm doing okay. I'm hoping to get out there and work hopefully either with the healthcare here in Arizona or work with a couple of organizations that are going to try and fix our redistricting problems going forward. But there are people here in our community who are doing this work every single day and don't know a month from now if they can afford to keep their car. So those are the folks I want you to reach out to and follow them and help build them up so that, you know, 10 years from now, they're kicking my butt and I'm being like, oh yeah, I knew so-and-so back in the day. And I helped them get their first job because they're the ones who are running the presidency right now. I'm not sure if any of you guys have had a chance to look at some of the folks that have been chosen to work in the administration, but the fact that the deputy communications director was an intern for the YDA 7 years ago and is now sitting in that room and is going to be talking about the ways we're fixing our country is monumentous. So support the folks who've been doing the work. And when you're able to, go out there and knock a door.
All right, words to live by. Jeremy, thanks so much. And I want to thank everybody who came to the program today. We all got a lot out of it. We wish you all the best, and everybody would want you to come back again to Democrats of Greater Tucson. And on that note, I'm going to say so long, Jeremy, and so long to everybody else. Have a swell day.
I just want to announce, okay, well, thank you, Jeremy, but I would like to announce that next Monday, our speaker is going to be Jonathan Rothschild, the former mayor of Tucson, who's going to talk about his new endeavors and what he is doing to promote or get people to minorities and other people to run for offices. So please join us next Monday.
All right. Thanks very much for that, Sandy. And thanks for getting a tough to book guest like Jeremy. I know you used your family connection. So, all right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.